Hey everybody, this is Mark with some notes before you listen to this new episode. A couple things needed, I think, a little clarification during the episode, so I thought I'd handle that now. One thing was we talked about the Whistle Pig Rye a lot as if it was the only Whistle Pig Rye out there. And in fact, there's quite a few, and there's a few different mash bills. The one I was referring to, I think because I've been into a great Whistle Pig 10-year-old store pick, is that 10-year-old that's 100% rye. So I want to make that clear. There's certainly other Whistle Pigs that use different mash bills. The other was we talked about distilleries during Prohibition and how many were allowed to sell whiskey, and I thought it was 4 to 6, and they were all in Kentucky. Turns out it's 6. 4 were in Kentucky, 1 was in New York, 1 was in Pennsylvania, so us close. And then the last one was that we talk about chill filtration and non-chill filtration, and I said something to the effect of you won't find a crappy non-chill filtered whiskey. Maybe that makes it sound like chill filtered whiskeys are crappy. That's certainly not the case. There's lots of great whiskeys that Dana and I both enjoy that are perfectly fine and very tasty and are chill filtered. And so I still drink a lot of Wild Turkey. I drink a lot of Jim Beam products and others that are chill filtered and enjoy them just fine. So I didn't want to make it sound like anything chill filtered wasn't good. So that's about that. If you have any questions for us, if there's topics you want us to cover, just go to thepracticalstill.com, hit the ask button, and fill in that form with what you want us to talk about, and we'll do our best to get to it. That's about it. Let's get on to the episode. Thanks.
Hey, Mark, why do some ryes just taste like bourbon?
That's a good question, Dan. Hey, this is Mark Still at The Practical Still here with Dan Cavallari, and we're going to talk about ryes and bourbons and why it's hard to tell the difference sometimes.
Let's start with the absolute bare bones basics here, Mark. For those of us just getting into whiskey, wait a minute, there's more than one kind?
Yeah, there's lots of kinds, and the two we tend to talk about the most are bourbons, of course, and then rye whiskeys. But American whiskeys in general, what's what and why it's called rye or this or that really just has to do with the grains that make up the recipe and how much there is of each grain. And so to be a rye, no kidding, it has to be more rye than anything else in there. So a rye has to be at least 51% rye. The other grains can be pretty much what anybody wants to put in them. With a bourbon, got to be 51% corn. And the rest of it can be pretty much what you want to put in it.
So when you say it could be anything you want to put in it, what are some of the other things that are generally in whiskeys?
Well, the most popular rye, corn, malted barley, and wheat. Those are the 4 that we see more often than not. But when I say pretty much anything, people have used amaranth. In fact, one of the harder to get, more popular unicornish type bottles is an E.H. Taylor whiskey that uses amaranth as the main grain. You can use, wheat. I mentioned wheat, but there's other grains like even quinoa has been used in whiskey before.
Yeah, rice too. I've seen others.
Right, rice whiskey. That's true. And I mean, if you back up even further, we're talking about a group of beverages known as distilled spirits, and as you work your way down, what a vodka is, or what a gin is, or what a bourbon or a rye is, or even a single malt whiskey has to do with the grain makeup. And so there's rules about that. Bourbon's got very specific rules about what it takes to be a bourbon, and ryes do too. They vary, and you can get in a little more trouble with ryes because if you buy a whiskey that just says rye whiskey, I think the amount is 2.5%. They're allowed to have 2.5% of stuff besides grains and water and yeast in that whiskey that they don't have to disclose. Bourbon's not that way. Bourbon has to be the grains, the yeast, the water, and time. And we talked in a previous episode about the word straight. So if you get to a straight rye, then you're a little safer because it can't have those extras. If it's a straight rye, it has to just be the rye and the other grains and the water and the yeast and time.
Mm-hmm. So just to summarize here, really the important number here is 51% because the bourbon, the mash has to be 51% corn at least, correct? And then with rye, it has to be 51% rye.
That's correct.
All right, so I got it right. Yes. So that's it's it seems like it almost seems like a nitpicky sort of thing, right? Like, so the question at the top of the show is, why do some ryes just taste like bourbon? Well, the answer to that seems kind of obvious, doesn't it? I mean, if we're only talking about, 1% margin of error here, they could be very similar, right?
They could. They don't have to be. So there's a lot of very well-known brands. For instance, Jim Beam, that makes both a bourbon and a rye, but there's not that big a difference. So the bourbon might have, I don't know, 70-something% corn, but their rye might also have 37 or 40% corn, even mixed in with the rye. And so then it becomes a little tougher to tell the difference. But if you look at something like a Whistle Pig rye, it's 100% rye. There's no malted barley or no corn in that at all. It's pretty easy to tell that that's not a bourbon. And then one of the more popular recipes or whiskeys that's distilled at MGP, a very large distillery and used by many different bottlers and non-distilling producers, that's a 95% rye, 5% malted barley mixture. It's pretty easy to tell that's a rye too. So it isn't that it's always that way. It's just that some producers produce a rye that's just barely a rye and a bourbon that's just barely enough corn to be bourbon. And then it gets tough to tell the difference sometimes.
Why in the world? Okay, this may, I don't know even if this is a question you can answer, but why in the world would you do 95% rye and then 5% barley? Why not just go the whole way and do 100%? What does that barley add?
Boy, Dan, that's another. We could have started the whole thing with a question like that. So in the fermentation process, if you just had corn or you just had rye, it'd be hard to convert the starches to sugars. And that malted barley, because of the malting piece of that, helps to start that process of fermenting. So turning the starches that are in the corn and the rye and other grains into sugars, and that's essentially what fermenting is. We're consuming that starch and coming up with sugar, so later we can distill that sugar and get the alcohol out of it. And so if you don't have a malted grain in there, and I'm no distiller, this is just from reading up on it and watching moonshiners, then you either have to have that malted grain or some kind of enzyme to help start that process. So
Gotcha.
That's probably why. I don't know why they came up with that, but I'm guessing it's because of that. It aids the fermentation process without having to add any additional enzymes to it.
So let's talk a little bit about history here, because I know rye is sort of having a little bit of a renaissance, and I don't know how long it's been going on, but I know that before Prohibition, rye was pretty popular, and then after Prohibition, it sort of fizzled, and bourbon took over. Why is that? I mean, what is it that's so different about these two types of whiskeys that bourbon kind of came out on top?
Well, I think it's a bit of just a historical, not happen chance, but it's just because of the way things evolved. So, pre-Prohibition, Kentucky was important in distilling, but it wasn't the center of American distilling. That was in closer to your neck of the woods, from where you're from, the Northeast. So Pennsylvania, that area of the country, really was the center of distilling, and rye was the grain of choice because that's just what they grew in that area. And there were a few different styles of rye from back then, and they were very popular, and that was probably the predominantly distilled grain at the time. When Prohibition came along, I mean, that lasted a really long time. There were very few distillers that made it through. I can't remember the exact number. I believe it was either 4 or 6 distillers that had permission to distill whiskey during Prohibition for medicinal purposes. You and I still use whiskey as such. And those distillers were not Pennsylvania distillers by and large. They were Kentucky distillers. And I think at that point, Prohibition was a long time. And some of those smaller distilleries didn't open back up after Prohibition. And that left it to bourbon or, the Kentucky area. And in that area, corn's the predominant grain. And so, bourbon wins. I think the reason it's resurging is it's really good.
Yeah.
And I think craft distillers have a lot to do with that. As a grain itself, if you look at bourbon, it's a majority corn, and some of them are 51%. But the big players, the Beams, the Wild Turkeys, a lot of the Heaven Hill products, you're in the 70 to 80% corn. Corn is very sweet. It doesn't have an awful lot of flavor. And so the other grains, the rye and the malted barleys, the wheat and the malted barleys, those are referred to as the flavoring grains. There's more flavor per batch of grain in a rye than there is corn, really. And so if you go as a new distiller and you need to get a product on the shelf quicker, the rye itself has more flavor in it. And so in 2 or 3 or 4 years, it's got a better chance to develop, whereas it takes a little longer, I think, for bourbons to make it. So maybe that's a reason. I don't know for sure.
Well, and also, I mean, I think, it's a matter of taste. I mean, I don't know if this is why it sort of had a quiet time. It sounds like there was more historical events that really led to rye taking a back seat for many years. But I can tell you the resurgence certainly must have to do with the flavors. And because I do feel like a pure bourbon versus a pure rye, very different flavors. If you get some of those ones that are done right, and I've got two in front of me, two of my favorites, Peerless rye and Pikesville rye. And Pikesville is just so much spice and clove and cinnamon and just big flavors. And that's sort of like a complete opposite experience as one of your favorite whiskeys, Weller, which is a wheated bourbon, which to me is mellower and sort of caramel and lighter flavors, a different experience. Is that hitting something? Is that resonating with you there?
Yeah, I mean, in the Weller bourbon, it's absent rye. The secondary grain, the flavoring grain of rye is replaced with wheat. Wheat's a softer, sweeter grain. That you're right on point with that. And the Pikesville, I don't know the mash bill of that right off the top of my head, but it's certainly more of that. Not 95%. It's probably it's going to be much more in that straddles the line kind of feel. Although they use that same mash bill, I believe, for Rittenhouse, and it's styled after more of a Pennsylvania style rye. But that's probably why you get that. You're getting the spice of the rye. It's still round and it's still got other spices in it because it does have corn and malted barley in it too.
Right. And I don't want anybody to mistake that spiciness that we're talking about with burn. I think those are two distinct things. Burn is, you talk about alcohol and high proof and things like that, and you get that real it's very aggressive mouthfeel. That's not exactly what this is. This is more of like a spicy cinnamon clove experience. Like it's really a big flavor, but it doesn't have to be either. So the other rye I have in front of me is the Peerless rye, which have you had the Peerless rye?
I have not had it. No.
Okay, I was gifted this bottle.
If only I had a friend that had some and there wasn't a giant virus in the place.
There's a little bit of corona between us, yeah. But this Peerless is interesting. I opened it and I love the Peerless bourbon that you turned me on to actually. And this rye, I cracked it open and I was a little stunned by the nose. It wasn't much. And I guess maybe I was used to the nose of Pikesville, which is probably my favorite rye. But then I tasted the Peerless and holy cow, it is good. It's not as big and bold as the Pikesville, but you still get that rye flavor profile. And I wonder how much of that has to do with the mash bill. I'm sure you don't know that information off the top of your head, but what other factors might influence that, do you think?
I think with the Peerless, there's probably two things, and I'm pretty sure they do this with the rye, but they don't use a sour mash process like most whiskeys. And sour mash just means once they mash all those grains, they save some of that and put it back into the next batch. And back in the days before decent sanitation, that was a way to help the fermentation process of the next batch, kind of keep things going without going bad. But Peerless uses a sweet mash, which means every time they mash whiskey, it's a brand new start. So that's going to be part of it, is that it's a different process than almost every other whiskey is using, American whiskey. And I think the other piece is age. The Pikesville is a 6-year-old product. The Peerless, I don't know which version you've got of it, but if it has no age date, it's just now gotten to be a 4-year product. So there's a couple years difference in that age. So that you could be feeling some of that, because a younger whiskey, you're not going to get as much of the oak from the barrels and not as much of probably the char, but you're going to get that age feeling from that. And that can be a lighter feeling on the nose.
Mm-hmm. I know I didn't really give you many prep questions before we started recording, so I'm keeping you on your toes here. But I'm also correcting, or I'm grading you, as I'll say, as we're going. And you are absolutely correct. Right here on the bottle, it says strictly sweet mash, and it is there is no age statement. So you're probably right. It probably is a younger whiskey. But here's another term, and I know this is something you look for a lot, and this is probably a topic for another podcast episode, but just really briefly, the Peerless also says it is non-chill filtered.
Oh yeah.
I love the romantic look that gets in your eye when I mention that phrase.
I get very poetic.
Yes. Where's the glass?
Yes. Where's the oration glass? We need the cradle glass so we can orate properly.
Yes.
Yeah. So filtration is a big deal with whiskey geeks, and I think that for those of us that whiskey's a visceral experience as much as it's. I love sitting around with friends. We share it. There's an experience as it enters the mouth, and some of that's the aroma on the nose. Some of that's the flavor, but some of that's the feel. And mouthfeel is one of those geeky whiskey terms that as soon as you say it, you think, "I wish I hadn't said that." But it's true, and so
so many things in my life I feel that way about.
Yeah, that's us. But the issue or the deal with filtration is that at some point that whiskey's ready. And there's char from the barrel. There are also esters and cogens and chemicals and things that are pulled from the wood and that are there because of the interaction. And some people feel like those materials, those properties, can make a whiskey harsh, or it certainly can make it cloudy below a certain proof. If you take a non-chill filtered whiskey and put some ice in it, or a drop of cold water, you'll see a clouding around that. And that's those heavier chemicals, those stickier chemicals that bind together when they get chilled. And so if you chill the whiskey and then filter it, you're more likely to pull those out. And the idea is that, there's a lot of ideas. I suppose one is that if it's below a certain proof point, you don't get that cloudiness because the uninformed consumer could see that cloudiness as a bad thing, where whiskey geeks see it as a wonderful thing. You also have the issue of, is the whiskey smooth or not? So there's all kind of reasons that, and consistency. I think if you pull some of those chemicals out, those agents out, then you end up with a more consistent product. But largely, when whiskey became so commercial, then that chill filtration allowed it not to sit on a shelf and not get cloudy. It's funny, if you go on the tour at George Dickel Distillery, they proudly talk about chill filtering their whiskey, where Scotch drinkers know you look for the non-chill filtered Scotches. But the story they tell you is that George, as he was distilling in 2 seasons, they generally distill in 2 seasons, the fall, warm and a cooler season. The whiskey tasted smoother in that cooler season, and that's why he began to chill the whiskey before he filtered it back then. So, as you can tell, I'm a tremendous fan of chill filtration, non-chill filtration, and I will go out of my way to choose a whiskey that's either unfiltered or non-chill filtered, and that's something I look at before I look at proof, or before I even look at a mash bill. I'll geek on something, because here's another little tip: as you're on the shelf, there's not a lot of cheap, crappy, non-chill filtered whiskey. If you're doing cheap, crappy whiskey, you're going to chill filter it to try and pull out the stuff that you weren't good enough to distill out of it in the first place, or age out of it.
That's interesting, because two things I often hear from you is, that you're a fan of the non-chill filtered whiskeys, but also you're a big fan of Dickel. So that's quite a contradiction, and I think
it is, isn't it?
Yeah, you're so deep. But that just speaks to different tastes and different flavors, and chill filtered, Dickel does it proudly, because I think they end up with a flavor that they like, and so much of what we are talking about is just finding a flavor that you like.
Yeah, I'll defend myself a little bit. I do like Dickel branded products. So the newer, it's not really new anymore, at least a few months ago, but the 13-year-old also bottled in bond freak, but the 13-year-old bottled in bond Dickel bottle is fabulous. I love it. I like a Dickel flavor. I know that a lot of people don't. But when I say I'm a huge fan of Dickel whiskey, I'm also drinking a lot of whiskey distilled in Tullahoma, Tennessee, yet not labeled George Dickel. And a lot of that whiskey has not undergone chill filtration and is given to us in the glorious presentation of barrel proof. So those two things are lovely, barrel proof and non-chill filtered. The other thing about Dickel whiskey itself is it's Tennessee whiskey, which means it's undergone the Lincoln County process, which is really the only thing that differentiates that from bourbon. And basically, once it's distilled, before it goes to barrels, it's filtered through charcoal. And that charcoal, or as Jack Daniels calls it, the charcoal mellowing, takes a different batch of things out and adds a different batch of things to it. And I don't know for sure, but I believe some of those old barrels that get bought have not undergone that process. So I couldn't say for sure, and I'm sure it varies, but that's my defense of I really like non-chill filtered. It doesn't mean I don't like chill filtered whiskeys. And it certainly doesn't mean I don't like the Dickel profile, because I really do. I get really excited when I flip a bottle of something like barrel bourbon over and one of the states of distillation listed as Tennessee, because you pretty much know that's a Dickel product. There's not many other. There are a few now, but there's not many other aged products on the market from Tennessee that didn't come from Tullahoma.
Sure. You could have just said you like Dickel, and
no, I couldn't. If I could do that, we wouldn't get on a podcast together and ramble about this stuff.
Fair point. Fair point. We do need to fill time. You're right. So let's get back on track here, talking about ryes again. So for those out there who are, they're listening to this podcast for a specific reason, perhaps because they bought a rye that didn't really strike them as anything different than any other bourbon that they bought. What's your beginner's guide to buying your first rye?
Well, I think before you even go there, you bring up a really good point, is don't give up after one. I think that goes for bourbons too. And it's really difficult these days because you can walk into a liquor store, head to the bourbon shelf. You might make one of 6 or 7 choices. And if you're not paying attention, you might end up deciding over one bottle or the other, and that whiskey might have come from the same place. And so there's a lot of variation in whiskey. And then there's some that might taste familiar, even though they don't have the same label on them. So just don't give up. Don't assume you don't like rye just because you bought a bullet rye and it didn't strike you. That bullet rye, anything you're going to buy on the shelf today was distilled in Indiana. It's using that 95.5 split mash bill. But if you were to turn to the Pikesville you mentioned, or the Wild Turkey 101 rye, which to me has a very similar experience to the Pikesville, it's a completely different whiskey. So I think to answer your original question of what's the beginner's guide, if you're already drinking bourbon and you like bourbon and you want to stretch into a rye, try one of the versions that's just the barely a rye route, or the middle ground. So don't go to a Whistle Pig because it's going to be very distinct. Stop at that Wild Turkey rye. Try that. Try the Jim Beam rye. Try those that are in that camp that don't necessarily push you all the way into something that's heavily rye. And then if that strikes you and you like that, then maybe move over and try a Whistle Pig. There's some whiskeys, and we don't see many of them here, but trying to revive that Northeast history of whiskey production in New York. There's a group of distillers that are doing a lot of rye whiskey. They've even come up with their own designation of Empire Rye, similar to the bottled and bond designations and rules. They've got a set of rules where the rye has to come, 75% of it, I think, has to come from New York. Local grains, it's got to be produced there. It's got to have a certain age statement on it, or at least a certain age. And that's something you can point to, but take the steps at a time. Don't assume because you like one whiskey or don't like one, you won't care for the other style. The ryes are varied. And you don't have to start with a 100% rye product. Try something that's not so far away. If you like Wild Turkey bourbon, try the Wild Turkey rye. If you like a lot of the Heaven Hill bourbons, try Pikesville or Rittenhouse. They're both distilled by Heaven Hill. Or if you can get a hold of, if you're in a state where you can get a hold of the new Elijah Craig rye, try that. They're all the same mash bill, but they get treated different. But try that. And that way it's a stepping stone and not stepping off a cliff.
Sure. And as is the case with so much of what we've been talking about on all these podcast episodes is that you don't have to spend a fortune to get a good one. I mean, that Wild Turkey rye is not an expensive bottle.
No, it's not. But I do think it's worth going to the Wild Turkey Rye 101. There is an 81 proof version. And I think it's a much better experience. But yeah, I buy the 1 liter bottles of Wild Turkey 101 rye. I pay $39 for them. So I think that's pretty reasonable for a liter bottle. Pikesville's a little much. I mean, it's a $50+ bottle. Worth it, but now Rittenhouse is a bottled and bond, straight rye, $26, $27. Mm-hmm. I mean, you just can't.
And that's funny because
hard to beat that.
It's also Rittenhouse is strangely getting harder to find. So if you do see it and it is a good price, grab it. Worth checking out.
You just may not see it. You got to look lower on the shelves.
I'm always looking low on the shelves. How about that Old Forester rye? I know you're a fan. I'm not so much.
Yeah, which is funny because you are really into a couple of the bourbons.
Mm-hmm. That 1920.
Yeah, I'm a gigantic fan of the Old Forester rye. It's suggested retail price is $23, $24. It's 100 proof. I mean, it's no age statement. It's a straight whiskey, which means it's at least 4 years old. And of course, Brown Forman and Old Forester are nothing but quality. I love it. Now, if you just don't like the flavor, like you just don't seem to like it, well, that's one thing. But I like a lot of Old Forester. In fact, what I'm sipping on now is a single barrel Old Forester bourbon from a club pick that, I mean, it was a $35, $40 bottle of whiskey that holds its own with some twice that price.
Yeah, it's just something. I mean, I love this. I love the Old Forester 1920. I killed it last night, actually. But boy, there's just that rye just is not my flavor. But the funny thing is with Pikesville, and I bought it blind. Pikesville's interesting. I bought it blind on your recommendation and just said, you know what, I'm going to try it. Didn't realize it was a Heaven Hill product until I got it home. Turns out I really, really like Heaven Hill stuff. So in retrospect, it's not surprising that I really like that stuff. And I think that just goes back to the flavor profiles that just happens to come out of that distillery. So I think I've sort of found my home there.
Yeah.
But
well, I think a couple things that, don't give up after one try. Makes an argument for sipping your friend's whiskey or having one at a bar, maybe if that's the way to try it. Two, there's good ryes, just like there's good bourbons. There's maybe less of them, but there's good ryes at a bunch of price points. And if you keep your eye on the prize and make sure you just buy straight rye, then you're going to be pretty safe. I have a horror story I love to tell about. Maybe I won't mention the brand, but I was in a liquor store one day.
I know this story.
What I went to get wasn't there. I had not done my research, and there was no internet connection when I saw this particular bottle with its cool label and its story about pre-Prohibition and Al Capone. And you probably know what I'm talking about if you story. And so I bought it, and I got it home because I like rye whiskey. And I poured it, and I tasted it, and I thought, that tastes like a cocktail. What an odd thing to think, drinking's neat whiskey. And so a little bit of research turns out this particular company at the time, and I'm so angry about that situation, I've never gone back to it, but they employed a chemist because it turns out if you have a rye that meets today's rye recommendation, it's nothing like a rye that would have been produced in the early part of the before Prohibition. And so in order to make it taste that way, they use chemicals. And that's the thing that makes it taste like a cocktail. And that just angered me. That's that bit where if it's just a rye whiskey and not a straight rye whiskey, it can have more than just the grain and the water in it. So stick to the straight part. Don't give up at the first try. There's quite a few different versions out there. And try something you like. And for sure, don't give up if it just turns you the wrong way. I mean, when I first moved to Colorado, I wanted to buy a local whiskey. And 80 Laws was recommended to me. And I bought a little 2-pack of a 375 of a bourbon and a rye. And it was the worst thing. I mean, not just whiskey. It was the worst thing I've ever put in my mouth. I struggled. I tried to drink them. I just couldn't.
Yeah.
Couldn't identify the flavor. But it turns out that's malted rye. So a rye grain alcohol is different than a malted rye. So malting is just where the grain begins to germinate, and once it sprouts and germinates, that balance of sugars and such changes. And malted barley, I love. I like unmalted barley. I like malted barley. I like it every way I've had it. There's very few single malt whiskeys that I've not been a fan of. Malted rye tastes nasty to me, and so I don't do 80 Laws whiskey. I don't fault 80 Law for making bad whiskey. I think they make a quality whiskey. I just don't like the flavor. And every once in a while, I run across that and other things. I think you tried it. I bought the Woodford Reserve, one of their Masters.
Masters Keep.
Yeah. Whatever. No, that's the Wild Turkey. But they do 2 releases a year, and this last one was a chocolate malted rye. I just couldn't stand it, so I bought it, and it has that same flavor. It's not as prominent as the 80 Laws, but still, it's that malted grain. Now, if that was the first rye I ever tried, and I gave up, well, I would miss out on Whistle Pig, and I'd miss out on Wild Turkey Rye and Pikesville, and oh goodness, I'd miss out on Kentucky Owl Rye, which, as you know, that's Batch 1 Kentucky Owl Rye is my favorite whiskey I've had.
That is a delicious one, yeah.
So, I mean, I would hate to have missed out on that just because one flavor turned me off. So don't give up.
Yeah. I have one last question for you, Mark, before we wrap it up. A lot of bars and other establishments now offer a lot of rye cocktails. What is it about rye that makes it such a popular choice for cocktails?
I don't know. It's not bourbon. I think that a lot of the cocktails have sweet components. So, for instance, a Manhattan is essentially 2 parts whiskey, 1 part sweet vermouth at the most basic level. And that sweet vermouth, depending on the version, can be quite sweet. So, for instance, I use a sweet vermouth that's very sweet most of the time. And so I like a rye whiskey because the spiciness of the rye, it's not as sweet as a bourbon because there's less corn. The spiciness tends to punch through the sweetness of the vermouth. I think that makes a good combination. That, and I think the fact that, rye is just on the up right now. It's a popular thing to put in. That's the big reason. It's just balance. With cocktails, you're always looking for a balance. Is it sweet? Is it dry? Is it this? Is it that? And because a true cocktail is really, just spirit and just sugar and water and bitters, and now things like vermouth, fortified wines, that's all you have to work with. So balancing that out with different spirits of different complexities is how you end up with the balanced cocktail.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Mark, what are we forgetting to tell everybody about rye? Have we covered all our bases?
Probably not, but
hey, that's a good reason for you guys to listen next time.
Yeah, and you can't cover all the bases. I just I'm a big fan of rye. I like it a lot. I know I say that I'm a big fan phrase a lot, but there's a lot to like about whiskey, and there's a lot to like about rye. So don't give up. Try them. If you have any questions about particular ryes, hit us up with those too. You can find us on all the normal places on Facebook and Instagram at The Practical Still. Twitter's just Practical Still. You can email us, join our email list from the website, thepracticalstill.com. We'd love to have questions. I mean, sooner or later, we're going to run out of stuff to talk about, and we'd rather talk about things somebody wants to listen about. So let us know.
I never run out of things to talk about. Might not be whiskey related, but we could just have a little therapy session for me.
There you go. There you go.
Well, Mark, thanks for connecting and chatting rye with me today.
Yeah, it was a good time, Stan. Thank you.
All right. And like Mark said, if you guys have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.